Here, we will address train clustering models. To use a train clustering model, add a clustering model to the workspace. Once the clustering model appears in the workspace, open it up and specify the information that you need to run the model. A clustering model is an unsupervised model. What that means is that we're trying to group different records of data into groups or records that are similar in some way. In other words, there's no target to select. There's no target variable to select in the model setup. So the first thing that I do is I choose the type of model. In this case, I'm going to select all, and then I can also choose to specify the number of clusters. If I happen to know them, I can just choose the number between 2 and 1,000. I happen to know how many clusters I'd like the data grouped into, but in most situations, I'm going to let auto decide for me. This uses an automatic technique to choose the number of clusters. Finally, I can also choose a segment or values from a column to then train models for different subgroups of records. In this case, I'm not going to choose any segments. I also have advanced settings. So for all the modeling types, I can set up parameters for k-means, agglomerative clustering, Birch clustering, or k-modes. I can choose the evaluation metrics that I want. And I can also choose what features to include or exclude. In this case, I'm going to leave the advanced settings as they are, save the settings that I have for all models, and click Execute. When the cluster model is done building, I'm automatically presented with results for understanding the model. I'm presented with metrics cards, and there's a little information box so I can learn about these metrics. I can also switch between different results. So if I want to take a look at the results for a different modeling type, I can do that. If I had chosen different segments in the segment columns, I'd be able to take a look at those segments as well. I'm also given information that helps me to understand the model through a visualization. A clustering model groups different records or observations in a data set into similar observations or groups of records. So for example, I might notice that this particular cluster is off by itself. And so it's different than, say, the one that's colored in this green color. In addition to these clusters, I might want to know the rationale for why they're different. And I can take a look, for example, at this cluster 5 and take a look at the rationale or the cluster description. And I can see that this particular cluster is defined by the number of children, primarily as the most important cluster across 157 samples. If I wanted to compare it to a different cluster, such as cluster 0, I can see that cluster in the light blue is primarily based on a different number of children. And if I want to take a look at, for example, this purple cluster, or cluster 1, this is based on a number of children, as well as the region of people, and a different number of samples. And this way, I can understand how the data was broken down and explore the clusters further. What's important to note is that for clustering as well as for any type of model, the data is changed. And if I pull up the bottom area, I can visualize the data. So this tells me what is the predicted cluster for each of these observations. If there was segment information or model information, that is attached as well. And so if I wanted to see all of the records that relate to each cluster, I could easily sort those and take a look at, for example, all those that are a member of cluster 0 versus those that are a member of a different cluster, such as those that are part of cluster 7, for example. What's also important is, because this cluster information is written to the data table, I can use this downstream. So if I want to produce a visualization out of this with the different clusters, or do a selection, or do an aggregate to understand cluster membership better, I can go ahead and use this data further downstream.